Te Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. So we're reading today from Canto 2, Chapter 7, texts 43 to 45, but I'm assuming we just read out text 43 together? Yeah. Vedaham anga paramasya hi yogamayam Yuyam bhavascha bhagavanatha daityavaryaha Patni mano sacha manushcha tad atmajascha Prachi narbhir ribhuranga utadhruvascha Vedaham anga paramasya hi yoga mayam Yuyam bhavascha bhagavanatha daityavaryaha Patni mano sacha manushcha tad atmajascha Prachinabarhiribhuranga utadhruvascha Vedahamanga paramasya hi yoga mayam Yuyam bhavascha bhagavanatha daityavaryaha Patni mano sacha manushcha tad atmajascha Prachina barhir ribhuranga utadhruvascha Vedam hamanga paramasya hi yogamayam Yuyam bhavascha bhagavanatha daityavaryaha Patni mano sacha manushcha tadatmajascha Prachina barhir ribhuranga utadhruvascha Vedahanga paramasya hi yogamayam Yuyam bhavascha bhagavanatha daityavaryaha Patni mano sacha manushcha tadatmajascha Prachina barhirubhuranga utadhruvascha Vedam ham anga paramasya hi yogamayam Yuyam bhavascha bhagavanatha daityavaryaha Patni mano sacha manushcha tadatmajascha Prachina barhiribhuranga itadhruvascha. Should I read out the Sanskrit of the rest of them? Or yeah. So then the remaining two are Ikshvakur Aila Muchukunda Videha Gadhi Raghvam Bharisha Sagara Gayanahu Shadyaha Mandhatra Larka Shatadvannu Ranti Deva Deva Vrato Balira Murtara Yodilipaha Subharyu Tanka Shibhi Deva Lapipallada Sarasvato dhava parashara bhurishenaha ye nye vibhishana hanumadupendra datta partarstishena vidura shruta deva varyaha. So the word for it. Veda, know it. Aham, myself. Anga, O Narad. Paramasya, of the Supreme. He, certainly. Yoga Mayam, potency. Yuyam, yourself. Bhavaha, Shiva. Cha, and. Bhagavan, the great demigod. Atha, as also. Daitya Varyaha, Prahlad Maharaj, the great devotee of the Lord, born in the family of an atheist. Patni, Shatarupa, Manoho, of Manu. Saha, he. Cha, also. Manuhu, Swayambhuv. Cha, and. Tatatmaja, cha. And his children like Priyavarta, Uttanapad, Devahuti, etc. Priyavarta, Uttanapad. Prachinabharhihi. Prachinarbhi. Barhi. Ribhu. Angaha. Anga. Utta. Even. Dhruvaha. Dhruva. Cha. And. Ikshvaku. Aila. Muchukunda. Videha. Maharaj Janaka. Gadhi. Raghu. Ambarish. Sagaraha. Sagar. Gaya. Nahush. Adyaha. And so on. Mandhata. Alarka. Shatadhanu. Anu. Rantideva. Devavrata. Bhishma. Bali. Amurtaraya. Dilipa. Saubhari. Utanka. Shibi. Devala. Pipilada. Sarasvata. Uddhav. Parashara. Bhurishenaha. Ye, those who. Anye, others. Vibhishana. Hanuman. Upendra Datta. Shukadev Goswami. Partha. Arjuna. Ashtishena. Vidura. Shrutadev. Varyaha, the foremost. Translation. O Narad, although the potencies of the Lord are unknowable and immeasurable, still, because we are all surrendered souls, we know how he acts through Yogamaya potencies. And similarly, the potencies of the Lord are also known to the all-powerful Shiva, the great king of the atheist family, namely Prahlad Maharaj, Swayambhuv Manu, his wife Shatarupa, his sons and daughters like Priyavarta, Uttanapad, Akuti, Devahuti, and Prasuti. Prachinabharhi, Ribhu, Anga, the father of Vena, Maharaj Dhruva, Ikshvaku, Aila, Muchukunda, Maharaj Janaka, Gadhi, Raghu, Ambarish, Sagara, Gaya, Nahusha, Mandhata, Alarka, Shatandvai, Anu, Rantidev, Bhishma, Bali, Amurtaraya, Dilipa, Saubhari, Utanka, Shibhi, Devala, Pipilada, Sarasvata, Uddhav, Parashara, Bhurishena, Vibhishana, Hanuman, Shukadev Goswami, Arjuna, Ashtishena, Vidura, Shrutadev, etc. Purport. All the great devotees of the Lord, as mentioned above, who flourished in the past or present, and all the devotees of the Lord who will come in the future, are aware of the different potencies of the Lord, along with the potency of his name, quality, pastimes, entourage, personality, etc. And how do they know? Certainly it is not by mental speculation, nor by any attempt by dint of limited instruments of knowledge. By the limited instruments of knowledge, either the senses or the material instruments like microscopes and telescopes, one cannot even fully know the Lord's material potencies, which are manifested before our eyes. For example, there are many millions and billions of planets far, far beyond the scientist's calculation. But these are only the manifestations of the Lord's material energy. What can the scientist hope to know of the spiritual potency of the Lord by such material efforts? Mental speculation, by adding some dozens of ifs and maybes, cannot aid the advancement of knowledge. On the contrary, such mental speculations will only end in despair by dismissing the case abruptly and declaring the non-existence of God. The sane person, therefore, ceases to speculate on subjects beyond the jurisdiction of his tiny brain. And as a matter of course, he tries to learn to surrender unto the Supreme Lord, who alone can lead one to the platform of real knowledge. In the Upanishads, it is clearly said that the Supreme Personality of Godhead can never be known simply by working very hard and taxing the good brain, nor can he be known simply by mental speculation and jugglery of words. The Lord is known only by one who is a surrendered soul. Herein, Brahmaji, the greatest of all material living beings, acknowledges this truth. Therefore, the fruitless spoiling of energy by pursuing the path of experimental knowledge must be given up. One should gain knowledge by surrendering unto the Lord and by acknowledging the authority of the persons mentioned herein. The Lord is unlimited and, by the grace of the Yogamaya, helps the surrendered soul to know him proportionately with the advance of one's surrender. Translation and purport by His Divine Grace, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. Om Jnanatimirandhasya Jnananjana Shalakaya Chakshurunmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manobhishtam Sthapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Kadamahyam Dadati Svapadantikam Vandeham Shri Guru Shri Yuta Padakamalam Shri Gurun Vaishnavamscha Shri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahagana Raghunathanvitam Tam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savadhutam Parijana Sahitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padan Sahagana Lalita Shri Vishakhanvitamscha He Krishna Karuna Sindho Dinabandho Jagatpate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostute Tapta Kanchana Gaurangi Radhe Vrindavaneshwari Vrishabhanu Sute Devi Pranamami Hari Priye Namo Mahavadanyaya Krishna Prema Pradayate Krishnaya Krishna Chaitanya Namne Goratushe Namaha Vanchakalpatarubhyascha Kripasindhubhya eva cha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Jaya Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shri Vasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. So, welcome to Srimad Bhagavatam class, where we just finished reading this very long collection of texts, and it's a very elaborate list of various elevated personalities, which is spoken by Brahma, who is, of course, himself also a very elevated personality. And so, he's speaking on the nature of the pure devotee to understand, the surrendered soul to understand the Yogamaya potency of the Supreme Lord. And this principle, Srila Prabhupada has elaborated in his purport, is a very important one, because one cannot access understanding the Supreme Lord through any means other than by surrender onto the Supreme Lord or unto his representative, or which includes all of the people on the list. These are people who are valid and able to represent the Supreme Lord. I'm reminded of Bhaktivinoda Thakur. He says in regards to the Ishopanishad, because we hear that the Supreme Lord, he's faster than all the devas. He's faster than all the demigods. And Bhaktivinoda Thakur, he makes the point that all of our senses, each one is presided over by a demigod. So therefore, if the Lord is faster than all of the demigods, he's faster than all our senses as well. If the demigods who are presiding over our senses can't reach the Lord, if the Lord wishes to run away, then what's the point of our senses? How can our senses then reach the Lord? If the demigods presiding over them cannot. And it's because of this that the futile attempts of the scientists will not reach any point. Because they are not only lacking in an understanding of the higher means of authority, and not only are they lacking that, and not only are they lacking a surrender to that, but they're lacking surrender in general. Science itself is very much built upon a very egoistic understanding of the world, if one is to take it properly. Right now at university I'm doing a course called the History and Philosophy of Science. And even though it's a bit of a debate whether it should be considered a humanities subject or a science subject, because it's history and philosophy, but then it's science. But if you do it, you'd think it should just be a comedy subject, because it's just a complete joke seeing how they try to justify their ideas. The whole course is just materialistic philosophers trying to explain why science should have any authority at all. And they'll end up with all sorts of absurd theories. Some of them was that any sentence that cannot be empirically verified through science actually doesn't mean anything at all. So if somebody says even something simple like 5 days ago my best friend had Wheat Bix for breakfast, this sentence actually is meaningless. They would say the words have no meaning because you can't scientifically verify them. So they'll say things like this doesn't make sense, even to common sense. But they have to go through all of these loops and issues and problems because there is actually no foundation for science itself. It's built on this idea that my perception of the world, they'll criticize the religious person, because the religious person will say there's a supreme personality of Godhead and we should worship him. And they'll say, oh, personality. They'll take a line from the Mayavadis and they'll say you're imposing your own human personality onto the Supreme Lord. So you're thinking humans are so important that there must be a personality, that persons are so important, there must be a personality there. But actually, that supreme reality must be composed of a personality. They'll say like this. But actually, they're the ones who are the most arrogant, because they are saying that my experience of the world, that is what determines truth. That the way I experience the way the world filters through my senses, that is the way the world was to be. It makes some sense to say, and it is not so egoistic in comparison to say, that there is a personality whom all reality revolves around, that is not myself. But actually the scientist must say all reality revolves around not even my personality, but my senses. All reality is determined by the verdict of what my senses perceive. So they'll come up with all these issues. And in fact, one of the most popular philosophers of science, Karl Popper was his name, he actually had to conclude that we can't actually know anything. That was the final conclusion of his idea. We can't know anything at all. He said science can only tell you what isn't true, but it'll never tell you what is true. Science can have a hypothesis, and it can reject that hypothesis, but it'll never be able to actually say this is true and this is real. And in fact, not to go too much into it, but there's a whole other party then that said we can't even say nothing's true. We just can't say anything at all. That's what they ended up doing, because it's so hard to justify. Without a higher authority, it's in fact impossible to justify any sort of philosophical idea. C.S. Lewis, who's a famous Christian author, would make this point. He'd say, if I can't say that there is a God to say that there is a validity to my mind, if I can't say that there is a soul or something spiritual, then all in my brain is a random coincidence of chemicals. Why should I trust any thought that has come from my mind? If it's all just a happy accident, then maybe every one of my thoughts is just a happy accident. No idea I can ever have, trying to think just from myself can have any validity. And there must always be a lack of security, an imperfection in the thoughts I think. And obviously, this is a line of thought which has been perfected by Srila Prabhupada. And in our line, we know this, the 4 defects of the conditioned being, and therefore all knowledge that comes through the scientific means obviously is not necessarily all wrong. This is a big thing that, especially with the youth, whenever I tell them that, they'll always say, oh, but science gave me phones. Srimad Bhagavatam didn't give me my phone, but science did. But the point is that, that even though the knowledge might be there, it may be valid, it is never perfect, and it definitely isn't holistic, because it's taken through the filter of one's senses. So, this science, the materialistic science, it is not capable even of proving itself, let alone proving anything else. And still today they're confused. My professor, he's one of the world experts on the history and philosophy of science, and he'll still say today, he'll say, I don't know how we can justify this. He said it's still a mystery. How can scientists actually believe in science consistently? So even the scientists, if you push them hard enough, they can't explain. Because the scientific method, the whole idea of testing, it's a philosophical idea. It's an idea of philosophy that only my senses have value. They'll say, oh, we aren't going out on faith by accepting any supernatural dimension. But by denying a supernatural dimension, that is an act of faith. The devotee will speak and they'll say there is a supernatural dimension. But saying that there is no supernatural dimension is just as much a statement about supernatural existence as saying that there is one. Saying that there is none is equally a claim on its existence. And therefore it's just as much an act of philosophy and even of attempting spiritual thought, even if it is a spiritual thought denying any spiritual reality. It still is a movement in that direction. So all of this high ground that the scientists tried to claim is actually non-existent. And then with the final point that I was alluding to, the scientists can't justify science itself. You can't take the scientific process and put it through a Bunsen burner or something. The scientific process itself has to be accepted on faith. And therefore, they cannot justify their own ideas. The devotee has the hand up because we have all of these great authorities. And we can say that these authorities are true, and we don't need to say, come up with some weird mechanism, because by the same way that we accept these authorities to be true by the authority of the Vedic scriptures, we can also say this is a whole reason why it should be believed. The whole reasoning of accepting the Vedas as accepted through the parampara is explained by the parampara by itself, and therefore the parampara itself, the transcendental science, Srila Prabhupada would say, parampara is the Vedic science. This science does not cause these internal contradictions. It does not cause these internal tensions. Because by the receiving of the parampara science, the knowledge as well of how to justify one's own thoughts, of how to justify accepting these authorities comes as well. It is a complete package. Because again, it is the, as Srila Prabhupada so nicely puts in the Ishopanishad, it is the avaroha panta. The parampara literally means one after the other. And avaroha means the descending process. It is a descending process, one link after the other. And we need to accept such a parampara, because otherwise how can we understand, how can we accept such high things? How can a finite being grasp infinity within the fist of his mind? Which is why it's so important to acknowledge and worship the great devotees. We know so famously in Bhagavatam, it says, Mad Bhakta Puja Bhyadika, that the worship of the devotee is greater than the worship of Krishna. Because when Krishna wishes to express himself, when Krishna wishes to give mercy in this world, it is through the devotee. This process of those people who have understood the Yogamaya potency, of them giving out then the knowledge of the Yogamaya potency, in many ways then empowered by this internal potency. This process is the means by which Krishna expresses his mercy in the world. And so it is through the worship of this that we can receive knowledge. Sometimes it's referred to, the Vaishnavas are not referred to as Tatastha Shakti. Obviously they are, being spirit souls, but they are referred to as the Kripa Shakti of the Lord. They are the Shakti itself of mercy. Because how else does Krishna administer mercy upon the world but by the disciplic succession? And this disciplic succession, it is not to be considered one just of names. Sometimes we'll flip open to the opening of the Bhagavad Gita as it is, and there's a series of names, and they're in the past, and now we're in the present. And those names are gone by, and they're recorded in history. But actually, this parampara is very much alive. Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur would sometimes make the point, when asked by his disciples, what is our parampara? Because at the time, the standard of initiation was, at the time of initiation, your guru would give you a list of his Diksha Guru and his Diksha's Guru, Diksha Guru, and you'd give this their form in the spiritual world, which they were given, and you'd give this list all the way back to Mahaprabhu's associates. Like this. So he would say, he initiated him, he initiated him. Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, he would never give this list. Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur would give that parampara that we have in the beginning of Bhagavad Gita as it is. And it sort of seems to jump streams. Baladeva Vidyabhushan's Diksha Guru was not Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, it was Radha Damodar Goswami. Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur's Diksha Guru was not Jagannath Das Babaji, it was Bipin Bihari Goswami. So this seems to be a violation of the current etiquette, the current standard. And so Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur's disciples would say, you know, what's our Diksha Parampara? You're giving us a list of how our knowledge is coming, but how are our mantras known to be valid? And Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur would say the Parampara is not a list of bodies. It is not a list of bodies of this mantra went through this person. It is a living thing. It is a living flow of knowledge. Not just that this body passed on this mantra to this person. What can we say then? Jiva Goswami has defined Diksha as what? The definition of Diksha is the passing on of Divya Jnana. Diksha is the passing on of Divya Jnana, not of the recitation, maybe of some mantras. We know there's the... There's a pastime of Ramanujacharya with Yamunacharya. So Ramanujacharya, when he went, he heard, he had the invitation. Yamunacharya had invited him to visit him after he had heard of Ramanujacharya taking to the spiritual devotional Vaishnava life. And Yamunacharya, he was passing away. And at the time Ramanujacharya arrived, unfortunately, it was already too late. Already Yamunacharya had passed away. However, we know the pastime. The 3 fingers still were shut. 3 fingers were still held shut. And at this point, with his 3 fingers held shut, Ramanujacharya, he inquired of Yamunacharya's disciples. He inquired, did Yamunacharya always lie down like this? Did Yamunacharya always have his 3 fingers closed like this? And of course they said, well, no. And Ramanujacharya, understanding the heart of the devotee, again, because this role of taking himself as a disciple of Yamunacharya is not the process of dead bodies speaking mantras to each other. It is not the process of an empty ritual. It is the process of the acceptance of Divya Jnana. It is the acceptance, and what is Divya Jnana? It is not the recitation of mantras or of shlokas. Divya Jnana is the acceptance of the mood of the spiritual master in one's heart. Divya Jnana is the realization of the transcendental knowledge, the understanding of the Yogamaya potencies, which is being referred to in this text. The understanding of this Yogamaya potency, that is Divya Jnana. And that is understood not as a static thing, not as the Jnanis would understand it. The knowledge, we sit down, we understand it. In Shankhya, they'll think if we count all the elements of the world, then we'll be liberated. If we truly understand them, then we'll be liberated. It is not that. It is a dynamic thing. To truly understand the nature of the Yogamaya potencies comes in what means. Srila Prabhupada says, we are all surrendered souls. It procures a dynamic response of surrender. Surrender to the spiritual master and therefore the acceptance of his mood, and thereby surrender to Krishna. So to understand this Yogamaya potency, to receive the Divya Jnana, which is the definitive element of Diksha, there must be a dynamic response. So this is how that process happens. So understanding these three fingers to be the three requests, we know Ramanujacharya, he makes the three promises. And at each one finger lifts. So he promises to preach Vishnu Bhakti and to perform the Pancha Samskar, the Urudhva Pundra, Tapas, all of the 5 samskars. We still practice most of them. We've tapas, which was, we see the Sri Vaishnavas still today, they brand themselves with, like, sometimes they'll brand animals, they'll brand themselves with the hot iron, and then with that mark they'll put on. In the Gauriya Sampradaya, it ended up becoming something a bit easier. They used to just write names of the spiritual master or of the Ishtadev in tilak on the bodies of the devotee. And then in our line, we don't seem to follow that too much. Bhaktivinoda Thakur has said the actual essence of tapas is the period in which one is aspiring under the spiritual master. When he is aspiring under the spiritual master and there's a sense of testing, this is the essence of tapas, because it's to test one's sincerity, because people don't just get branded for the sake of it. So this essence is fulfilled in ISKCON at least, and also in other places following the line of Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, by that period in which one is being assessed and purified under the spiritual master before receiving initiation. And then there's of course Urdhva Pundra, which is the tilak. There's taking the mantras for deity worship. There's receiving the holy name. There's a few of these. So these are the Pancha Samskar. And these are the signs that Vaishnav Diksha has occurred. But they are external signs. As I said, Bhaktivinoda Thakur, he said without the internal realities of these Pancha Samskars, of these 5 samskars, they are not to be considered fully done. With the tilak, he said tilak points upwards. Therefore, one should reorganize one's life pointing upwards. There should be a direction of one's life towards spiritual reality. And if this does not happen, then what is the point of wearing tilak? Bhaktivinoda Thakur, elsewhere in his bhajans, he makes the point of the false devotee, the Avaishnav. He is a person who is having kantimala around his neck, tilak on his forehead, and another man's wife on his lap. But he is having all these external signs. Again, without the internal aspect, what is the point? So, Ramanujacharya, he said, I will do this, I will spread out the Pancha Samskars, which means initiating many disciples, and I will preach the glories of Vishnu Bhakti. Then, I will make commentaries on the great works of the Alvas. The Alvas, the Alvas, of course, they're the great South Indian poets. They've written so many works. Some of their works, even they're referred to as the Tamil Veda. His Holiness Bhakti Vikas Maharaj actually has released a publication, a translation of a few of their works, commenting upon them, because actually there's hidden prophecies of Srila Prabhupada and Chaitanya Mahaprabhu in them, in the works of the Alvas. So, they're very wonderful Vaishnav texts, and even they can be found to be appreciated from a Gauriya Vaishnav perspective. So, they're very sweet, and Ramanujacharya, he said, I will comment upon these. And then, lastly, he said, so that's speaking of the Bhakti tradition, with Ramanujacharya, his great work was that after Shankaracharya, he was the first real bhakta to preach on a grand scale, and to reclaim Vedanta, reclaim the study of the Vedas, and put it within the domain of the Bhakti Vaishnav tradition. So, on the one hand of his mission, there's a commentary on the Alvas, the devotional Bhakti texts. And then for the third wish, the final finger, which then gets relaxed, and then Yamunacharya can peacefully depart, is, he said, I will make a commentary on the Vedanta Sutra. And he writes, we have the Govinda Bhashya for Gauriya Vaishnavas, and there's a Shri Bhashya, because of course the Shri Vaishnavas are coming down from Lakshmi. So, he writes the Shri Bhashya, the commentary on the Vedanta Sutra. So there's the merging of the two lines, the merging of devotion and of Vedanta. Again, they've been brought together, because of course the natural conclusion of Vedanta should be devotion, but under the temporary preaching mission of Shankaracharya, that had been hidden. So with these three things, then Yamunacharya, he is satisfied. And this, in many ways, is the essence of an initiation. Even if maybe there is no speaking of a mantra. This very much, again, is the passing down of that transcendental realization and the transcendental mood. We have the opposite example in Ekalavya. Ekalavya, we know, everyone loves Mahabharata. And Ekalavya, he so much desired to be trained by Drona. And, of course, Dronacharya said, no, I won't train you. And so Ekalavya, he goes in the forest and he produces a murti of Drona, and he trains and trains and trains under it. And we know the pastime, he's shooting into dogs' mouths and but still keeping them alive, doing all sorts of things. And eventually then Drona finds out, and Drona, he says, well, if I'm your spiritual master, then you must give me some dakshina. And he asks for his thumb. And then after he takes his thumb, still Ekalavya is a great archer, but he's not as great as he used to be. Often people use this example, they say this pastime is an example of devotion to the spiritual master. They'll say, look how determined he was, that even though his spiritual master said no, he still kept on worshipping him. And some people, they'll say like this. But Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, he's commented on this pastime. And Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur has said, Ekalavya, actually he is the reason why his thumb was taken, was he was the example of the perfect non-disciple. He is the example of the limits, of the most furthest away one can be from a true disciple. Because a true disciple would hear their spiritual master say, I do not want to train you, and then never be trained. That is the level of submission one should have to the parampara, to one's spiritual master. Of course, Drona in that sense wouldn't even be the spiritual master. He's in a mundane sense, but still we can understand these archetypes. The mood of submission is still properly had for all teachers. Now people barely have it even for their spiritual master, let alone for the more mundane gurus. But at the time, the attitude should have been the same. So, by this pastime we understand, Ekalavya, he was not very much in the mood of what a true disciple is. The true disciple should be willing to even, if the spiritual master says, I do not want to train you, you will never learn, he accepts that as Guru's mercy. We know again Ramanujacharya's pastime. Ramanujacharya, he went before his spiritual master, one of his spiritual masters. He had many. And he performed dandavats. And he was in a very hot place. And he was doing dandavats for so long that his skin, it was starting to almost burn for a long, long time. But in obedience to his spiritual master, Ramanujacharya, he was showing perfectly the mood of the disciple. Until his spiritual master asked him to rise, he would refuse to rise. But then Ramanujacharya, he had his own disciple who was there. And Ramanujacharya's disciple also showed the perfection of the disciple. Because he went to his Param Guru Dev and he said, what are you doing? Ramanujacharya, he's burning here. He is in so much pain. Why aren't you telling him to go up? And so Ramanujacharya's guru, he was very happy. He said, this person should serve you intimately for the rest of your pastimes. So committed he is to being committed to the service of his spiritual master, to maintain the well-being of his spiritual master, that he would even risk going to hell by chastising his Param Guru in order to serve his spiritual master. So it is in these moods of submission, submission to the spiritual master, that we find what is the essence of the science. Because that is the other fault with material science. The scientists, they will go on, they will have all these ideas, but they themselves will never have any practical application in their life. The pedagogy of the Vedic version is not one of just Shravanam. It is not just one of hearing. It is Shravanam, Mananam, and Nididhyasanam. It is hearing, dwelling upon, and then realizing. In the Bhagavad Gita, we know that's very, very famous shlok. And it speaks of what? Pranipatena pariprashnena sevaya. Only one of those is listening. Only one of those is intellectual. The rest is paying respects and then rendering service. The Vedic pedagogy is so valuable because we can truly understand, because the knowledge is practical. It is necessary to be realized in order to be taught, and in order to be understood, it must be realized as well. It must be practically applied. The scientists, they will do all sorts of things. Maybe they'll understand the depths of every atom and every molecule, but at the end of the day, they're still very depressed. His Holiness Bhakti Vikas Maharaj just recently gave a few lectures about so many motivational speakers who try to approach through means of psychology and all these things. And he was finding that actually the suicide rate and depression rate among them is higher than even the normal person. Even though they are giving examples on how to progress in one's life, how to taste happiness apparently, because they're approaching through all their speculative means, it's almost disillusioning because they think I should have all the answers. But I don't. And there's the proof in the pudding. How then should we accept this method as being valid, as being necessary to the achievement of the human life, if it doesn't even produce results in even the apparent masters' lives? So, it must be realized and it must be accepted through a mood of surrender. And by this means, again, this living parampara can go on. This living parampara can be understood. It can be accepted. Because it is a passing down, not of a mantra. A tape recorder can pass down a mantra. But a tape recorder cannot pass down the mood, the instruction, the mercy of the living representative, of that alive person. And still, that person themselves, they are a continuation, a personification of everyone who's come before. We'll see on this list, we find Brahma, we find Shukadev. The great acharyas, they are only representing Brahma. All of the glorification we can say of Brahma, we can say also of the great acharyas, because they're coming in that line, stemming from Brahma. And why Brahma? Because Brahma was the one who first heard Bhagavatam. Brahma, he heard Bhagavatam, and then he passed Bhagavatam down, which is why Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, he didn't call that parampara in comparison to the other paramparas of the time. He did not say it is the living parampara, even though sometimes that comparison was made. He said it was the Bhagavat parampara. It is the parampara of the Bhagavats, the person Bhagavats, and in that sense we can also find off this list Shukadev Goswami is being represented. Because these person Bhagavats embody that book Bhagavat, but also because it is a passing down of the knowledge of Srimad Bhagavatam. Link after link we'll find the Bhagavatam is being spoken. The Bhagavatam is being spoken and it is being understood to differing degrees. And then eventually at Madhavendra Puri, it is blown up, and then the Bhagavatam is fully understood. And then at Sri Krishna Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, that full understanding is then blown up again, and it is established in preaching. And then at Srila Prabhupada, that Bhagavatam is then spread out at the fullest extent. So all of these great devotees, they are all representing, they're all coming in a line. The science of parampara is merely to represent the link before perfectly. And sometimes that's expressed differently. Again, coming to that question of form. Srila Prabhupada said, I did pretty much everything the exact same as my spiritual master. But Srila Prabhupada, in many externalities, didn't. Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur didn't give second initiation to women, but Srila Prabhupada did. Srila Prabhupada has a slightly different performance of the daily artis. Guru Puja was not done daily in the Gauriya Math under Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, but it's done daily in ISKCON temples. But that's of course not to say then that Prabhupada was lying or something absurd like that. Prabhupada didn't do anything different to his spiritual master. But again, it must be understood. In the same way, Ramanujacharya, just by seeing the 3 fingers, he understood the desire and the wish of Yamunacharya. What does it mean to not do anything different from the spiritual master? It means to properly internalize the mood. It means to properly internalize the essence of everything. Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur was instructed by Gaur Kishore Das Babaji to never go to Kolkata. And yet, he started the Gauriya Math in Kolkata. But he understood the heart of Gaur Kishore Das Babaji's instruction. It wasn't just the externalities that suddenly Kolkata is off limits. It was do not enter into the materialistic domain of the city. Do not enter into that hellish place. Actually, Gaur Kishore Das Babaji said something that I think lots of people can relate to. He said Kolkata is as close as you can get to the hellish planets on Earth. Because it's so filled, the cities are so... But then, what to say? Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur started the Gauriya Math there. Srila Prabhupada had his appearance there. So, that hellish place in many ways is transformed by the presence of such spiritual things. And one can experience both things if they go to Kolkata today. They can experience the hell and they can also experience Goloka on earth, if they wish. By, again, the mercy of that parampara. Because the parampara is, again, the means by which Krishna represents himself out into the world. It is a means by which Krishna can express himself. This point is made. How can Krishna even understand how the material world goes? He has not experienced material suffering. He has not experienced the way the material world functions. That is all external to him. Krishna is having fun in Golok Vrindavan. He's playing with the Yogamaya potency, playing with all of his friends there. But the devotees have understood. The devotees can understand because they are tatastha. They can experience Mahamaya as well as Yogamaya. Obviously, the pure devotees are constantly immersed in the internal aspect, in the devotional aspects, but they have some empathy for the condition of the jivas. Krishna does not have that necessary empathy in order to express that mercy. That's not to say then that Krishna doesn't experience mercy to the jivas, but he experiences it through his devotees. It is through the intimacy that he has with the devotees. Krishna doesn't directly know the suffering, or doesn't directly know or understand or empathize with the understanding of the suffering jiva. But Krishna does know his devotee, and his devotee can empathize with the suffering of the jiva. And therefore, Krishna is able to distribute that mercy through his parampara. And there we see that in Kolkata. Gaur-Kishore Das Babaji has said, this is hell on earth. But through the purifying nature of the sadhus, of the Vaishnavas, who are the bedrock of our devotional life, even in Kolkata then, the highest spiritual atmosphere is being manifested, again, through the mercy of those devotees. And how great then is the mercy of those devotees? We speak of the parampara, and there's so many great links in it. But Srila Prabhupada, he takes a very unique role because of that, because he has taken so much that mood. We know again, Ramanujacharya, he received that mantra on the vow that he would tell no one. He would say, I will tell no one this mantra, but I know it is sure. I'm still going to accept it because it is sure to give anyone liberation. And the moment he received it, he exited. And of course, Ramanujacharya, very famous, and there was a big crowd waiting for Ramanujacharya. And they said, did you receive the mantra? And then he, of course, he announced it and he yelled it and he told everyone it. He didn't just say that he received it, he spread it out to everyone. And then his spiritual master, he said, well, what have you done? How could you say this? You promised you wouldn't. And Ramanujacharya said, yes, and I did promise that. And for that, maybe I will go to hell. But it is true that this mantra will give liberation to anyone who chants it. And if it must work, then surely I will go to hell if it means giving liberation and salvation to everyone else. So then, in this mood, Ramanujacharya, he preached. And it's to be understood that actually his spiritual master was pleased by this, because again, he understood the essence over the form. In many ways, it was a testing. It was a testing of Ramanujacharya. Does he understand the true mood? Does he understand the true mood of the preacher, the true nature of this mantra? So he spoke it, and like this he preached. However, Ramanujacharya, he was a Shakti Avesh avatar, empowered by Ananta. Ananta, who speaks Bhagavatam constantly. And even with that empowerment, Ramanujacharya, he spread mainly Vaishnavism through Tamil Nadu, Andhra Pradesh, and Karnataka. Those are the main areas he spread Vaishnavism through, which is glorious, of course. And then we have Madhvacharya. Madhvacharya is said to be the incarnation of Bhima, others say he's the incarnation of Vayu. Either way, the incarnation of a heavy personality. And yet we find Madhvacharya, and so great a preacher, he's always holding two fingers up, because so much he stressed this point of the duality of the Supreme Lord and the devotee. So strongly he spread this point. So such heavy a preacher, and yet most of his preaching resulted in Karnataka. Outside of Karnataka, you won't find too many Tattvavadis. Even in Varanasi he went, but Varanasi is still held today as a Mayavad stronghold. And these are great devotees. It's not that none of them didn't understand the yoga, Maya potency, or anything. And they're all very valid to represent. But we understand Srila Prabhupada, much more than 3 states in India, or 1 state in India. Srila Prabhupada spread Krishna consciousness, he spread Vaishnavism in every state, in every country, all around the world. And there is a reason for this. Because the empowerment of Ananta Shesh is great. Ananta is constantly speaking Bhagavatam. So then how many glories of Supreme Lord can Ramanujacharya speak? But Srila Prabhupada was empowered by Nityananda Prabhu. Srila Prabhupada is a devotee of Nityananda Prabhu. Ananta is only an angsha, only an expansion of Nityananda Prabhu. And so Srila Prabhupada, he has spread this out so fully. Srila Prabhupada, therefore, we can accept as such a great representative of the parampara, because he has understood that essence so perfectly. That essence of preaching, that essence of establishing and spreading the Divya Jnanam, which is the essence of Diksha. This is the glories of Srila Prabhupada, that he is spreading that constantly. He has intuitively, so wonderfully understood the essence. There was one of Srila Prabhupada's godbrothers. Srila Prabhupada would sometimes speak some criticisms of his godbrother's lack of preaching. And so a disciple of one of Srila Prabhupada's godbrothers, he ran to his spiritual master and he said, you know, Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada, he's saying we are just bell ringers. We are just ringing the bell in the temple. That's all we are doing. Because this is Srila Prabhupada's criticism. Srila Prabhupada would say they have not understood the essence. Deity worship is great, but we can remove all the temples. Even Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur said, disassemble all the temples, sell everything if it means printing more books. Srila Prabhupada actually would say book distribution. If there is Sankirtan going, I was hearing a class from Bhakti Vikash Maharaj, if there is no mridangas, then they can be singing without mridangas. If there is no dances, then there can be the singing of the kirtan without the dances. But if there's only one person, better he distributes books and sings. The essence is that preaching. So Srila Prabhupada was saying this is the essence. Even the singing of the holy names will take a secondary role to the necessity of this distribution of the Divya Gyanam. Through the kirtan, still nevertheless, but the kirtan through the distribution of transcendental knowledge. So anyway, so he had criticized. He had said that they're only bell ringers. So this disciple of one of Srila Prabhupada's godbrothers, he ran to a spiritual master and he said, you know, Srila Prabhupada, he's saying that we're only bell ringers. And that godbrother of Srila Prabhupada, he said, you would be very fortunate to be a bell ringer in his mission. He said, if you could be ringing the bell in the mission of Bhaktivedanta Swami, Srila Prabhupada, then you would be the most fortunate soul. This is the empowerment of Srila Prabhupada, and this is the value of his work. Even of those godbrothers of Srila Prabhupada who weren't so envious, who were able to acknowledge Srila Prabhupada's position, even they would speak like this. They spoke such glorifications. Because again, this is Srila Prabhupada's glories. He so much took to the essence of spiritual life. And he distributed it around. This is the essence. Many people will say, all of these rasic things, these are the essence. We must hear of the Ras Leela and all the Madhurya pastimes. And they'll make these points. Sometimes I've heard another story from one of my friends. There was this one Babaji, very much known for speaking like Ras Leela and all of these sort of things. And a few of his disciples, they started saying about Srila Prabhupada, they were saying, oh, Srila Prabhupada only gave ABCs. This sort of nonsense, this sort of rascaldom they were saying. And even that Babaji, he said, without Srila Prabhupada, none of you would be in my room right now. And this was another thing that was said. Because Srila Prabhupada's contribution, if anyone has any vision, is recognized. The disciple actually of that godbrother who said you would be fortunate to be the bell ringer, he said every single Vaishnav on earth is only eating the remnants of Srila Prabhupada. All of our preaching is only the remnants of what Srila Prabhupada gave. So this is the so people will say only the essence of Gauriya Vaishnavism is to say all these rasic things, meditate on Ras Leela, Madhurya. And they will think like this, but this is a limited conception. This is not the highest conception. Because by preaching, by the audarya, by the mercy, coming in the mood of Mahaprabhu, Krishna comes in Madhurya, but Mahaprabhu comes in audarya. By the preaching, then so many people will actually be qualified to truly enter into Madhurya. If one preaches constantly Madhurya, rasic pastimes, rasic concepts, then all will happen is you'll create a bunch of sahajiyas. This will be the only result. Maybe one or two people by some previous sukriti purified enough to hear. But the majority won't be. And there'll be no effect. But by preaching and glorifying the Supreme Lord, by establishing these truths, by manifesting this mood of going out and distributing the mercy of Mahaprabhu, which we must do, we must follow in the Mahaprabhu's mood. He is the one who is to define our mood. Then so many people will be purified and eventually will be able to genuinely enter into such high things. So even of those rasic things, nothing serves it better than to speak apparent ABCs. But they're not apparent ABCs. They're actually the highest things. To preach Krishna as the Supreme Personality of Godhead, to preach that we should not enter into the 10th canto prematurely, to preach all these things is actually the highest service to these rasic things. Not openly blurting them out everywhere. Again, Srila Prabhupada has come to the essence of it, not an external idea. A person who will superficially think might think, well, you know, Mahaprabhu has come to taste Radha Bhav, we should be speaking of these things all the time. And this again is the form. They're misunderstanding the essence, the heart of it. So this is Srila Prabhupada's mercy, and this is why we'll find Srila Prabhupada actually, when he's referring to the Sampradaya as being Rupanugas. Normally, people before, they would say Rupanuga means following in the footsteps of Rupa Manjari, very rasic. But Srila Prabhupada, he made the point, he will always translate it as following the footsteps of Rupa Goswami. If we want to become like Rupa Manjari, we should become like Rupa Goswami first. We should understand, even though he's eternally liberated, he still did the pastimes of being a sadhak. We should understand, and what was the sadhana of Rupa Goswami? What is the sadhana of the 6 Goswamis? Jiva Goswami on his own wrote enough books that they are 4 times the length of the Mahabharata. The essence of the passing of the books, the essence of the writing of books, this is the distribution, if we cannot write, this is the essence of how to be properly accessing, again, these truths that they're speaking of. To truly understand the Yogamaya potency, to truly understand all of these things, there must be a kirtan done to purify oneself. And this is why the parampara is alive. Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, we know, Brihad Mridanga, this is the printing press. But there's actually a second Mridanga that Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur would refer to. He would speak of the Brihad Mridanga, which can be heard everywhere. But he would speak of his saffron army, of all his sannyasis and brahmacharis, as his living mridangas. Because who is to play the big mridanga? Who is to play it? If the books just stay, who will distribute them? So therefore his sannyasis are his living mridangas. Because they go out to send out this preaching. This kirtan can be heard all around the world through the Brihad Mridanga, only if they can be living mridangas in order to play it. So the living mridangas of the preachers are there. Which is why, again, the parampara is alive, because it lives through the preaching of those living mridangas. It is Srila Prabhupada said, I will not leave. I am there forever. How? Through my instructions. And that means, that entails that those instructions are followed. It is when Srila Prabhupada's desires, when Srila Prabhupada's instructions are followed, there is Srila Prabhupada. Where there is Sankirtan, where there is preaching, where there is a study of Bhagavatam, there Srila Prabhupada is living. But it is not to say that just by Srila Prabhupada's instructions existing in a vacuum, then we can say that Srila Prabhupada is always existing. In a sense, he is. It's not that we can damage Srila Prabhupada in the same way we can't blot out the sun. But in another sense, we cannot feel that just Srila Prabhupada will exist vaguely. His instructions must be implemented, and then there will be his presence at least will be brought alive to wherever his instructions are being followed. Which is why, which is again, speaking of the mercy of Srila Prabhupada, the parampara is alive because their instructions are being given and they allow us to practice those instructions, to preach those instructions, to distribute them out. And that's the way that the parampara is alive, through their kirtan. Srila Prabhupada's books will live forever. Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur's mood will live forever in the mood of Srila Prabhupada's books. In Srila Prabhupada's books, there is all the essence of all the previous acharyas, because all the acharyas perfectly represent the previous ones. And therefore the parampara is alive, so long as the kirtan, the sankirtan continues. And this is again that mercy. And so I'll conclude on a pastime, not a pastime, a glorification I read. I tried to read every Vyasa Puja through one of the previous Vyasa Puja offering books. And I read a really nice one from China, from Tamal Krishna Goswami's amazing preaching, very much embodying the mood of the living mridanga. And in that, the Chinese devotees, they were writing glorifications of Srila Prabhupada. And they said, in our Chinese language, we are so unfortunate. We do not have the letters by which we can write the name of Krishna. We cannot write the name Krishna. We have to find other ways to teach people how to say the name Krishna. But we do have the letters to say Prabhupada. We do have the letters necessary to write the name of Prabhupada. This is a reminder for us that Srila Prabhupada's mercy is always there. Srila Prabhupada, even if Krishna is not available, and he isn't available, why would he be available to conditioned souls like us who want nothing to do with him? But Srila Prabhupada